The morning light filtering through the expensive automated blinds of the suburban Seattle home was too weak to be truly cheerful, yet the house exuded an aggressive, manicured brightness. Clara Albright, 74 years old, sat at the small granite kitchen island, meticulously warming a porcelain teapot. This was her ritual: tea and quiet reflection. Every morning, she brewed a strong earthy blend of Russian caravan tea, a habit she'd carried from her 50 years in the rugged, quiet expanse of Alaska. It was a moment of peace, a tiny island of tradition in the chaotic sea of her son Ethan's modern high-tech life. Ethan, her only child, was a decent man, but utterly overwhelmed. He worked long hours in a specialized finance sector and measured his life's value by his monthly mortgage payment. His wife, Serena, was the house's true conductor. 42 years old, impeccably dressed, and professionally ruthless, Serena was a rising star at a cutting-edge investment firm called Thorn Ventures, specializing in large-scale tech acquisitions. She viewed efficiency as the highest virtue and Clara's presence as a chronic impediment to that virtue. Clara had lived here for 3 years, since her husband, a tough-as-nails gold prospector and bush pilot, passed away. She had sold her remote beloved homestead near Fairbanks and moved south, relying on Ethan's solemn promise: "You'll never have to worry about a thing, Mom. This is your home now." But in the last 6 months, the dynamics had shifted from strained coexistence to barely veiled hostility. Serena's contempt for Clara's simple, traditional ways had intensified, reaching a new peak with the upcoming holidays. "Mom, are you really using the cast iron skillet again?" Serena had asked the previous evening, her tone laced with surgical disapproval. "We use non-stick, Clara. It's more efficient, and it doesn't leave microscopic residue on my induction stovetop." Clara knew the truth. She didn't fit into Serena's perfect, sterile world. She reminded Serena that her husband came from rougher origins, that success wasn't always measured in smart home gadgets and high thread count sheets. The growing need for space. Serena's latest obsession was self-optimization. She had recently decreed that the large and used guest bedroom, the room Clara currently occupied, was essential for her new, rigorous fitness regimen. "Ethan, we need a professional-grade gym here," Serena had announced during dinner, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Clara. "The commute to the club is inefficient. If I'm going to close the stellar acquisition in Q1, I need to be operating at peak physical and mental performance. It's a business necessity." Ethan, weak-willed and desperate to please his wife, had offered a meek defense. "But Serena, where would Mom go? We don't have another spare room." Serena had just laughed, a high, brittle sound that cut through the silence. "Oh, please, Ethan. Clara's hardly ever here. She could stay in the small den downstairs, or better yet, she could go back to her sister's place in Anchorage. She misses the cold air, right, Clara?" Clara had merely sipped her tea, her gaze steady, registering the intentional cruelty. She had always been a listener, the person who noticed the shifts in the wind, the subtle signs of a coming storm. What her children failed to grasp was that Clara's unassuming life in Alaska had not been simple. It had been deeply layered. Her husband hadn't just been a prospector. He had been an early visionary investor in Alaskan resource and technology infrastructure, using the profits from his modest mining operation to secure silent, untraceable partnership stakes in various ventures. One of those ventures, established 30 years ago under a highly restrictive, grandfathered trust, was a small, high-risk equity fund. That fund had eventually grown, merged, and transformed into the massive, public-facing, multi-billion-dollar enterprise known today as Thorn Ventures, the very company where Serena Albright was now chasing her quarterly bonuses and career advancement. Clara's ownership, though dormant and managed by an old-school legal firm in Anchorage, was enormous. She held a 30% silent partnership stake, a block so large that if it were ever activated or liquidated, it could instantly trigger a hostile takeover, collapse the stock price, or, most critically, veto any major corporate action, like the massive stellar acquisition Serena was currently banking her promotion on. Ethan and Serena didn't know about the portfolio. They only knew about the small, monthly Social Security checks and the modest savings account that Clara used to pay for her tea and yarn. The Christmas countdown. With Christmas fast approaching, The tension was unbearable. Ethan avoided conversation, and Serena started measuring the guest room walls with a laser device, making it clear the renovation was imminent. On December 24th, Serena caught Clara doing her morning routine. "Clara, I need that room cleared by the 26th, Serena said, her voice dropping all pretense of politeness. "The Bowflex and the treadmill arrive, and the contractor starts on the soundproofing. Consider it your Christmas task. Pack up your little Alaska trinkets and those dreadful wool blankets." Clara didn't flinch. She just nodded slowly, taking a final deep breath of the calming tea steam. She looked Serena directly in the eye, her expression unreadable. "I understand, Serena," Clara replied, her voice soft but carrying the immense weight of the Arctic silence. "I will make sure I am completely ready to move out of your way." Clara walked to her room and closed the door. She didn't open a savings passbook or look at a stock ticker. Instead, she retrieved a single dog-eared copy of an old, laminated partnership agreement that had been filed years ago in Anchorage. An agreement bearing the company's archaic, original name, which had been legally carried over to the current Thorn Ventures. The paper was her ticket out, not just of the house, but out of her subservient role. The humiliation was painful, but it was also the fuel she needed to execute the quiet, devastating move her late husband had prepared her for. The game was about to change. Christmas morning was a cruel parody of celebration. The scent of cinnamon and expensive coffee mingled with the metallic tang of resentment. Clara had spent the previous evening quietly packing. She didn't have many possessions, a few worn wool blankets, a collection of Thomas's old prospecting maps, and her sturdy teapot, but each item was a connection to a life Serena despised. Clara moved methodically, folding her clothes and carefully wrapping a small, carved wooden bear Thomas had given her on their first Christmas in the Arctic. She hid the laminated partnership agreement, the single most valuable piece of paper in the house, in the bottom of a heavy, metal trunk she intended to ship back to her sister in Anchorage. It was camouflage, hide the treasure among the supposed junk. Ethan was miserable. He tried to reconcile his love for his mother with his fear of his wife. He placed a small, expensive gift bag on Clara's bedside table, a cashmere scarf. It was an offering of guilt, not love. "Mom, I'm so sorry about the room," Ethan mumbled to her later that morning, avoiding eye contact as he nervously adjusted a massive bow on a gift for Serena. "Serena needs the space. It's for her career, you know? The Stella acquisition is huge. I've looked into a few assisted living places in Tacoma that are very nice, small, but very modern." Clara simply put a hand on his arm, silencing his stammering anxiety. "It's all right, Ethan. I understand the demands of ambition." She knew he wasn't strong enough to choose her, and that knowledge was a quiet sorrow, but also a necessary confirmation of his moral cowardice. The Christmas gift. The gift exchange commenced at 9 a.m., precisely when Serena deemed the light perfect for Instagram stories. Serena presented Ethan with a massive high-end espresso machine, an unnecessary extravagance he would spend the next year figuring out how to pay for. Ethan, in turn, gave Serena a diamond tennis bracelet, another required display of financial status. Then, it was Clara's turn. Clara handed Serena a small, wrapped box containing a meticulously hand-knitted pair of thick, warm woolen mittens, the kind needed for a true Alaskan winter, not a damp Seattle morning. Serena opened them, her thin lips curling into an expression of theatrical distaste. "Oh, Clara. How rustic," Serena sighed, dropping the mittens into the box. "Thank you. I'm sure a homeless shelter will love these." Then, Serena reached for the last gift under the tree, a small, brightly colored envelope addressed to Clara. She had saved it for last, knowing it would provide the maximum dramatic effect. "And finally, Clara, a little something from the two of us. A practical gift that streamlines everyone's life and gets you back to your true element." Serena's smile was wide, but lacked any warmth. Clara opened the envelope. Inside was a single, laminated piece of cardstock. It wasn't a greeting card. It was a one-way, fully paid Greyhound bus ticket from Seattle, Washington, to Anchorage, Alaska, dated December 26th, 2 days away. Attached to the ticket was a small, crudely handwritten note, clearly penned by Serena. Bon voyage. Your Jim is waiting. Serena then burst into laughter, a loud, uncontrolled peal that felt like a physical assault in the pristine, quiet room. Ethan forced a nervous, weak chuckle, unwilling to meet his mother's eye. See, Clara? Efficiency. Serena managed between gasps of laughter, placing a hand dramatically on Ethan's shoulder. We just booked the delivery for the Bowflex for the day after Christmas. That room is mine. No more old lady sweaters and boring tea time taking up my premium real estate. The cold, hard vow. The laughter stopped, replaced by a sudden, glacial silence. Clara looked at the ticket, then at the note, then at the ecstatic cruelty in Serena's face. It wasn't the ticket that hurt, it was the public, premeditated humiliation, the absolute erasure of her value as a mother, as a person, and as a guest. Clara slowly placed the bus ticket on the coffee table. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't weep, and she didn't plead. Her composure was unsettling. The Bowflex is arriving the day after Christmas, you say? Clara asked, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. Yes. Early morning, 8 a.m. sharp. Serena replied, still beaming, completely oblivious to the danger. The contractor has the specs already. I need it ready before my Q1 due diligence. Clara nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. The stellar acquisition due diligence. I believe that is set to close in early February, correct? A major, high-stakes, highly sensitive deal for Thorn Ventures. Serena, caught off guard by Clara's sudden, professional focus, paused. Yes, it's monumental. It will make my career. Why do you ask, Clara? Clara didn't answer. She stood up, retrieving her small purse from the counter. Inside, she reached for a piece of paper that Thomas had insisted she keep separate from the partnership agreement. A business card, discreetly printed and carrying only 2 lines of text. Julian Thorn. Direct mobile. Emergency only. Julian Thorn was the septuagenarian CEO and original founder of Thorn Ventures. Clara retreated to the guest room, now irrevocably defined as Serena's future gymnasium. She sat on the edge of the bed, the Christmas Day chaos of wrapping paper and forced merriment muffled by the expensive insulation. The bus ticket lay on the pillow beside her, a tangible, laminated symbol of her disposable status. She knew she had mere hours to act. If she waited until the morning of the 26th, the gym equipment would arrive, the contractors would descend, and her move out would be a fait accompli, a narrative of quiet resignation that would validate Serena's cruelty. Clara needed to move her pieces before the physical renovation even started. She pulled out Julian Thorn's discreet business card. Julian Thorn was a legend, a brilliant, fiercely private CEO who, even in his late 70s, commanded the entire architecture of Thorn Ventures. Clara knew that he tolerated no distraction, no financial risk, and absolutely zero high-profile incompetence in his senior staff. Clara placed the call to Thorn's direct mobile line. It was Christmas Day, and she expected only a voicemail, but the phone picked up after the second ring. Thorn, Julian's voice, sharp and gravelly, answered instantly. There was no pleasantry, no greeting. Mr. Thorn, this is Clara Albright. I apologize for disturbing your holiday, Clara began, her voice steady and modulated, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced down blizzards and bears. Silence stretched for a moment on the line. Julian Thorn knew the name Albright. Ethan was a mid-level analyst, but the name was inextricably linked to the company's genesis. Mrs. Albright, Thorn finally responded, his tone shifting from impatience to cautious curiosity. I haven't heard from the Albright family in nearly 20 years. How may I assist you? It concerns the stellar acquisition, which your firm is scheduled to close in the next quarter, and it concerns the Albright family's silent partnership in Thorn Ventures, Clara stated, dropping the code phrase Thomas had instructed her to use only in extremis. Julian Thorn's posture on the other end of the line must have changed instantly. The silent partnership was the corporate equivalent of an unexploded ordnance. He was one of the few people who knew that the vast, opaque, 30% founding equity block, an essential cornerstone of the company's stability, was still technically held in an aging, archaic trust linked to Thomas Albright's original seed money. "Mrs. Albright, you have my complete, undivided attention," Thorne said, all holiday pretense dissolving instantly. "The particulars of that equity block are strictly confidential. I believe the ownership is managed by Stone and Harris in Anchorage." "They manage the trust, yes," Clara confirmed. "But I am the lifetime administrator and the voting proxy. My husband made sure of that. And my son's wife, Serena Albright, is currently managing the internal due diligence for Stella, a fact I assume you know." "Yes, Ms. Albright is highly regarded." "What is the nature of your concern, Mrs. Albright?" Thorne asked, his voice now dangerously level. Clara delivered the precise, devastating assessment Thomas had taught her to reserve for maximum impact. She didn't complain about the bus ticket. She didn't mention the gym. She focused solely on the structural integrity of the deal, linking Serena's personal ambition directly to corporate risk. "The nature of my concern, Mr. Thorne, is that Ms. Serena Albright's personal ambition, coupled with an extreme, documented lack of judgment, is now an active, high-probability threat to the successful completion of Stella," Clara stated. "She is leveraging her family's financial stability, my son's financial stability, entirely on the Stella closing bonus. That level of personal debt exposure and reckless decision-making means she cannot be trusted with the due diligence or the final closing negotiation. She has an active conflict of interest." Thorne absorbed the accusation. An executive whose personal finances depended entirely on the outcome of a single massive deal was a liability waiting to be exploited by competitors. He knew Serena was aggressive, but he hadn't realized her personal exposure was this extreme. "And what action are you requesting, Mrs. Albright?" Thorne asked. Clara took a final, deep breath. "I'm requesting that you place an immediate, internal freeze on all actions related to Stella and specifically on Ms. Albright's access to the final closing documents. I will also be sending a formal notification, via Stone and Harris, confirming that as the 30% silent partner, I reserve the right to veto the entire Stellar acquisition if I deem her continued involvement constitutes a fiduciary risk to my equity. Until I get clarification," the silent partner says, "no sale." The threat was immediate and total. Thorne Ventures was built on complex shareholder agreements. A 30% block, even silent, could not be ignored. If Clara decided to vote against the acquisition or activate her stake, the entire deal, the company's stock price, and Julian Thorne's legacy would implode. "I understand, Mrs. Albright. You will have my answer within the hour. Please prepare to follow up with Stone and Harris immediately," Thorne replied, ending the call abruptly. Serena's cryptic warning. Downstairs, Serena was attempting to video chat with her mother, bragging about the bus ticket triumph. Her phone rang with a corporate number, and her face tightened. It was Julian Thorne's chief of staff. Serena stepped into the hallway to take the call, her voice shifting instantly from jovial to professionally crisp. "Yes, this is Serena Albright. What can I do for you on Christmas, David?" She listened for a moment, her eyes widening in disbelief, then horror. The chief of staff was terse and formal. "Serena, Mr. Thorne has requested that you immediately cease all active due diligence on the Stellar acquisition. You are to hand over all your files to Mr. Chen by the end of the day. Effective immediately, you are being moved to a non-acquisition-based internal audit team until further notice." "What? Why?" Serena gasped, her professional composure completely breaking down. "I'm leading Stellar. I've been working on this for 9 months. This is my promotion." Mr. Thorne was extremely clear, "Serena. This is a directive from the top." He cited an immediate, high-probability conflict of interest and unacceptable fiduciary risk concerning the Albright family's financial exposure, David stated, his voice flat. He specifically mentioned a highly sensitive, corporate governance issue. He suggests you review any long-dormant shareholder agreements that might affect the firm's stability. That is all I can share. Good day, Serena. The phone clicked dead. Serena stood in the hallway, the blood draining from her face. Conflict of interest, fiduciary risk, long dormant shareholder agreements. She slowly looked toward the stairs, where Clara's room was. Her laughter, her triumph, and her bus ticket gift now felt like a curse. She had kicked her mother out for a gym, and in return, she had been ejected from her entire career. She had no idea how, but she knew Clara was somehow involved. Serena's Christmas Day was officially ruined, replaced by cold, burning panic. The transfer of her stellar acquisition files to Mr. Chen, her direct rival, was humiliating. The internal memo, vague but devastating, cited critical governance issues and unacceptable fiduciary conflicts. Serena knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the core of the problem lay in her personal life. She drove straight to Thorn Ventures' deserted office tower, her mind racing. Who had contacted Julian Thorn? Who had the power to stop a multi-billion-dollar deal in its tracks using a corporate governance loophole? Her first suspect was a competitor, but the language, fiduciary conflict, Albright family exposure, pointed internally. She and Ethan were financially leveraged to the hilt. The Stellar bonus was their lifeline. Who knew that? Only a handful of people, and none who had the ear of the CEO. Except for Clara. Serena sped back to the house, arriving late that evening. Ethan was already drunk on expensive whiskey, sitting on the sofa, nursing the shock of his wife's sudden professional implosion. What the hell happened, Serena? Thorn called me. He asked if there were any unforeseen capital structure risks linked to my family name. He even mentioned my father's old prospecting firm. Ethan slurred, his face drawn. Serena ignored him, her eyes fixed on the guest room door. Clara was sitting calmly at the small desk, reading a book of poetry. The room was mostly packed, but the calm radiating from Clara was unnerving. What did you do, Clara? Serena demanded, her voice shaking with rage and fear. You made a call today. Who did you call? Clara slowly placed her book down and looked up at her daughter-in-law. There was no anger, only a deep, profound pity. I made a call to the CEO of Thorn Ventures, Julian Thorn, Clara confirmed softly. I simply introduced myself as the silent partner and advised him that his due diligence executive had created a situation of unacceptable risk to the firm's core assets, specifically by demonstrating a profound lack of character and judgment toward an original equity holder. Serena laughed, a strained, hysterical sound. Original equity holder? You. Clara, you sold a small Alaskan homestead 3 years ago. You have $50,000 in your savings account. You can't even afford the bus fare back to Anchorage without the ticket I gave you. The reveal of the portfolio. Clara pushed a small, battered leather briefcase across the desk. It wasn't flashy. It looked like something a clerk would have carried in 1965. Sit down, Serena, Clara instructed. This is a lesson in financial history and the true meaning of leverage. Serena, too shocked by Clara's new demeanor to resist, sat down. Clara opened the briefcase and pulled out the single laminated document. The original Albright founding partnership agreement for Arctic Resource Equity Fund Incorporated, the company that had evolved into Thorn Ventures. Clara traced a finger across the document's masthead. When Thomas and his partners founded that tiny equity fund 30 years ago, they structured the shares with 2 classes. Class A, Julian Thorn, management control, and Class B, Thomas Albright, silent equity and veto control. Clara explained, her voice steady. Thomas always believed that the original investors deserved protection from the inevitable corporate greed that follows rapid growth. He insisted on an anti-dilution, anti-sale clause, a 30% silent equity stake that carries a full voting proxy on any major corporate acquisition. She tapped the section marked, Veto Power. This stake is not held by the Albright Family Trust, Serena. It is held by my personal trust, established when Thomas sold the last of his gold claims. It is untraceable, non-public, and perfectly legal. It is 30% of Thorn Ventures, Serena. A 30% block is too large for Thorn to ignore. It's enough to block the Stellar acquisition, tank the stock, and expose Julian Thorne to a hostile takeover by your rivals. Serena's jaw dropped. The scale of the financial power, a 30% founding stake in a multi-billion-dollar firm, was incomprehensible. She realized she hadn't just insulted a dependent mother-in-law, she had threatened a titan of her own industry. Why didn't you ever sell it? Or tell Ethan? Serena whispered, her professional mind finally kicking into gear. Because Thomas wanted to preserve the peace, and he wanted the integrity clause preserved, Clara replied. If the stake was active, you and Ethan would have spent decades pressuring me to sell. It was meant to remain silent, secured by an old-school legal firm in Anchorage, available only in a crisis. The irreversible damage. Clara then delivered the final crushing blow, directly addressing the core of Serena's professional disaster. Today, Serena, your bus ticket became my crisis. I proved to Julian Thorne that you, his due diligence executive on a multi-billion-dollar deal, are so compromised by personal financial pressure you created by demanding a gym and spending beyond your means, that you publicly ejected the shareholder who holds the 30% veto power over the entire deal, Clara stated. Thorne did not move you to a different team because he thinks you are a bad analyst. He moved you because he realized you are a massive, exploitable corporate liability. Your high-stakes desperation and lack of judgment are now a documented risk to the firm's fiduciary duty. You cannot, ethically or legally, be allowed to touch the stellar closing documents. Serena was speechless. She had spent a decade building a reputation on efficiency and ruthlessness, only to have her own greed weaponized against her by the very woman she sought to humiliate. She hadn't just lost the stellar bonus. She had been permanently blacklisted from any senior acquisition role at Thorne Ventures. Clara quietly picked up the laminated partnership agreement and returned it to the briefcase. She left the one-way bus ticket on the desk. I will be leaving, Serena. But not on the Greyhound bus you so generously provided, Clara said. Mr. Thorne is arranging my transport to Anchorage, where I will be meeting with Stone and Harris to determine the long-term future of the silent partnership and the fate of his firm. Until then, you can tell the Bowflex delivery man that the gym floor is occupied. 48 hours after Clara's quiet departure, chaos reigned supreme at Thorne Ventures. Julian Thorne, the CEO, had immediately flown a private jet to Anchorage, Alaska, instructing his most senior legal team to meet him at Stone and Harris, the old-school legal firm that quietly managed the Albright Trust. Clara, wrapped in one of her heavy Alaskan wool coats, met Thorne in the firm's wood-paneled, drafty office. Thorne was a man used to commanding boardrooms, yet he treated Clara with a level of deference he reserved only for essential capital. Mrs. Albright, I have reviewed the original partnership charter in detail, Thorne stated, leaning across the table. Your 30% Class B stake is not just passive equity. It is the definitive protective mechanism against reckless corporate maneuvers. If you veto Stellar, the market will assume a massive, internal governance rift, and our stock will drop at least 15%. This is a corporate cataclysm. Clara poured herself a cup of black coffee from a thermos she brought herself, ignoring the expensive catered spread. Then you understand the weight of the situation, Mr. Thorne. My son's wife, Serena, used her position of influence to financially and emotionally liquidate her mother-in-law, the woman who holds the 30% veto power. That is not just bad judgment. It is a fiduciary collapse. If she is willing to risk a $300 billion company's stability for a personal gym, what is she willing to risk for a $5 million bonus? Thorne didn't need convincing. He needed a solution. What is your demand, Mrs. Albright? We will restructure her entire department. We will guarantee your son's financial future. Just give us your full voting proxy for Stellar. My demand is not financial, Mr. Thorne. It is structural, Clara replied. Serena Albright must be removed from the acquisition team entirely, and her employment status at Thorne Ventures must be adjusted to reflect her demonstrated lack of judgment. Furthermore, I require a permanent, ironclad guarantee, written into the trust's bylaws, that my personal assets and the 30% stake can never be touched, leveraged, or challenged by my son or his wife. I need complete and total peace. Thorne nodded, already calculating the cost. Firing a rising star was cheaper than losing 30% of his company's market capitalization. Within the hour, the legal paperwork was signed. Clara's 30% stake was formally transferred to an ultra-secure, irrevocable, anonymous holding structure managed by Stone and Harris, with a legally binding clause stipulating that any challenge to Clara's management of her assets by Ethan or Serena would trigger an immediate, mandatory liquidation of the entire block, a threat that would instantly destroy Thorn Ventures' market stability, ensuring neither child would ever dare interfere. Julian Thorn walked away with Clara's voting proxy for Stella, but he left behind Serena's career and Ethan's future. The financial fallout in Seattle. The financial and social fallout was immediate and public. Serena, back in Seattle, was initially placed on administrative leave. But the moment the news of the 30% silent equity block was leaked, a strategic move by Thorn's team to explain the CEO's sudden emergency trip to Alaska, the narrative changed. On Tuesday morning, Thorn Ventures announced that Serena Albright had been terminated for cause, citing irrevocable failures in fiduciary responsibility and extreme risk exposure stemming from undisclosed personal financial conflicts. Serena's high-stakes career, the one she had sacrificed her family life for, ended in a single, devastating corporate press release. Ethan, whose financial security was entirely dependent on Serena's income and bonuses, was hit harder. The sudden loss of Serena's immense salary, coupled with the revelation that his mother controlled 30% of the firm he worked for, and had deliberately destroyed his wife's career, broke him. He stormed back to the quiet guest room, now empty except for the one-way bus ticket and a faint scent of Russian caravan tea. "Mom, how could you do this to us?" Ethan screamed into the silence. "You had $50 million worth of equity. You could have solved all our problems. You could have just bought Serena the gym membership." He realized his mother hadn't bought a gym membership, she had bought her peace, and the cost was his family's future. He had failed the ultimate test of character. He had chosen the wife who despised his mother over the mother who secretly owned a piece of the company that employed him. The contractor for the new gym arrived at 8 a.m. on Wednesday. Serena, still reeling from the termination, answered the door. "I'm here to install the Bowflex and the treadmill for Ms. Albright," the contractor said cheerfully. Serena stared at him, then at the empty room where her mother had slept. The room was cold, quiet, and permanently available. "The room is empty," Serena whispered, her voice hollow. "The gym is not needed. The space is permanently closed." She had sacrificed her home, her mother-in-law, and her entire career for a room she would now never use. The irony was a bitter, physical weight. Clara's flight back to Anchorage was not aboard the Greyhound, but a luxurious corporate jet arranged by Julian Thorn as a final act of appeasement. She was traveling to a peace that had been violently purchased, carrying the knowledge that she had permanently altered her family's trajectory. Upon landing in the quiet, familiar cold of Anchorage, she didn't stay with her sister, but checked into a small, well-appointed cabin she had purchased years ago near the coast, a retreat secured with the income generated by her silent stake. She was planning her return to the rugged simplicity of her old life, but with the shield of unimaginable wealth. Back in Seattle, the atmosphere in the Albright home was poisonous. Serena, unemployed and blacklisted, spent her days fighting with collection agencies and lawyers. The reality of her financial situation, stripped of the expected Stella bonus, was terrifying. Her massive mortgage, car payments, and lifestyle debt were now unsustainable. Ethan was a ghost. He still worked at Thorn Ventures, but the company's treatment of him was subtly punitive. He was constantly reminded that his wife's greed had nearly caused a corporate collapse. He was given mundane, dead-end assignments and denied opportunities for promotion. He was tainted goods, defined by his proximity to the disaster. The last confrontation. 3 weeks after Clara's departure, Ethan drove up to Anchorage. He didn't call ahead, he simply showed up at the cabin, his face etched with exhaustion and resentment. He wanted answers, forgiveness, and, most urgently, money. He found Clara standing on the porch, watching the faint glow of the northern lights begin to paint the December sky. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I was hoping you'd come, Ethan," Clara said, ushering him inside the warm, wood-scented cabin. Hoping I'd come to beg. Ethan spat, throwing his travel bag onto a small sofa. Mom, you ruined us. You had the power to save us, to clear the mortgage, to pay off Serena's debt, but instead, you destroyed her career. Why? To punish her for a bus ticket. Clara looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of her choice. No, Ethan. I didn't punish her for a bus ticket. I protected myself from her character. And I protected the 30% equity from your combined weakness. She pulled out a printed copy of the irrevocable trust restructuring agreement, which Stone and Harris had finalized. She handed it to him. Read the section on the liquidation clause, she instructed. Ethan scanned the legal jargon, his eyes widening. The clause stated that if either Ethan or Serena attempted to legally challenge Clara's control, or attempted to access the capital in any way, the entire 30% block would be immediately liquidated through a prearranged, high-volume stock sale. This would flood the market, crash the stock, and permanently ruin Thorn Ventures. An act of corporate self-immolation that would not only leave the children with nothing but would also expose them to criminal securities fraud investigations for market manipulation. This is insane, Mom. You locked it up entirely, Ethan exclaimed, the paper trembling in his hands. Your father insisted on it, Clara explained. He knew you would only see the current value of the equity, millions of dollars, and immediately try to leverage it for your expensive lifestyle. Thomas didn't want the equity to fund decadence. He wanted it to fund independence and safety for me. The liquidation clause is the only thing that guarantees you will never touch a cent. You are legally forbidden from pursuing this wealth. Ethan sank onto the sofa, realizing the finality of the situation. His mother wasn't just wealthy. She was impenetrable. The true gift of Alaska. Clara sat beside him. The greatest gift Thomas gave me wasn't the money, Ethan. It was the foresight. He knew the difference between real security and the illusion of wealth. She reached for a small, unadorned wooden box on the table. Inside were rough, uncut gold nuggets, the real physical treasure Thomas had originally panned in the Yukon. This is real wealth, Clara said, holding up a gleaming nugget. It's finite, it's honest, and it can't be leveraged or stolen through a corporate loophole. The equity was the tool to ensure I had the power to stop the leverage. And I used that tool to secure my peace. She then offered him a final, devastating truth about the bus ticket. Serena didn't ask me to move out for a gym, Ethan. She asked me to move out because I reminded her that her ambition was built on a fragile, borrowed foundation. She saw my thrift as weakness and your father's quiet wealth as an insult to her own frantic pursuit of status. She wanted to erase me. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded envelope. I have arranged a small, final provision for you, Ethan, she said. It is not from the 30% block, and it is not a bailout. It is the final amount from my liquidated personal savings account, the money I had set aside for my own funeral. Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for a modest amount, enough to cover 3 months of his mortgage and hire a professional divorce attorney. I am giving you enough money to end your marriage and stabilize your life, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle that nearly ruined you. You must now choose. Keep the house and the debt with Serena, or take this opportunity to walk away, sell the house, and start over with the dignity your father intended for you. Clara made it clear that her role as a safety net was over. Her son had to face the consequences of his complicity. She offered him a path to moral redemption, but zero financial indulgence. The curtain was closing on their codependent relationship, leaving Ethan alone in the blinding light of the truth. 6 months later, the aggressive brightness of the Seattle house was dimmed, replaced by the melancholy silence of foreclosure. Ethan Albright, having used his mother's final gift, the funeral fund, to secure legal counsel, had made his choice. He initiated divorce proceedings, opting to walk away from the crushing debt and the broken partnership with Serena. The separation was bitter and quick. Serena fought desperately, leveraging her termination as grounds for spousal support, but the trail of financial negligence and the damning fiduciary conflict memo from Thorn Ventures proved too much. She was left to deal with the bulk of the unsecured debt, her ambition having hollowed out her own foundation. She was now selling her unused high-end gym equipment online, item by painful item, just to cover the monthly interest payments. Ethan, humbled and exhausted, moved into a modest apartment. He was still employed at Thorn Ventures, but he no longer worked for promotion or status. He worked for simplicity, rebuilding his life based on necessity, not extravagance. He learned a profound lesson about the true cost of moral weakness. Clara was home. She had taken the immense, silent power of her 30% equity and used the income to purchase and restore the original, remote Alaskan homestead she and Thomas had built decades ago. It wasn't luxurious. It was genuine. It was surrounded by the rugged, snow-capped peaks and the deafening silence she loved. She had achieved total, unassailable peace. Her wealth was untouchable, secured by the irrevocable structure she had established with Julian Thorne. Her primary occupation was no longer dependent on her son's goodwill, but on tending her own life, the true form of independence Thomas had intended. One cold evening, as the midnight sun dipped below the horizon, Clara sat on her wooden porch, the wind carrying the scent of pine and salt. She was brewing her Russian caravan tea, a habit unbroken despite the chaos. She had received a brief, formal email from Ethan that morning. He had finalized the sale of the Seattle house and had used the remaining proceeds to clear his own small portion of the debt. He was financially solvent and emotionally sober. Clara raised her cup, the steam warming her face. She had traded the stifling demands of suburban expectation for the vast, honest silence of the Arctic. She had been insulted, humiliated, and exiled, but in accepting the cruelty, she had found the power to permanently veto the forces of greed in her life. She had protected the legacy, and in doing so, she had saved herself. Her true worth was never in the money she had, but in the power she held, silent and unseen, till the end. My name is Clara Albright, and my story is one of quiet strength against loud ambition. They saw an aging woman who was easily dismissed, mistaking my simple life for a lack of resources. They believed that by eliminating my room, they could eliminate my influence. But true power is not always visible. It is often found in the irrevocable structures you establish before the test begins. My husband ensured that I held the single most important veto power in a multi-billion-dollar corporation, not for profit, but for protection. The lesson here is simple. Know the true value of your position, no matter how small or silent it may seem. When they demanded my displacement for a gym, they activated my protective veto, which ultimately cost them everything they valued. They sacrificed their entire future for a temporary convenience. Your greatest asset is not your salary, but your ability to walk away, to say no sale to bad deals, bad relationships, and bad intentions. Tell me, as you listen to my story of finding peace in the Alaskan wilderness, where are you watching from?